All right, so this week's workshop is to make a wooden palette, and I have there's some pictures up with the assignment, including pictures of actual wooden palettes, just to give you some ideas, and then also some ones that some 3D folk have done. But the purpose of this assignment is to both utilize the duplication tools so that we can have make one thing and have multitudes of it, but also so that we can then take those multitudes and occasionally do something different to make it look interesting. So we're kind of balancing having a lot of multiples with having some differences in them. And so the actual making of one of these boards is really actually quite simple. We start with a cube, and then we can go into the attribute editor, go into the polycube one, and we can, change how we want this to look. So I tend to leave it as a depth of 1. You don't have to follow my numbers exactly. I want it to be longer. There we go. Um, I just want something that vaguely looks like a 2 by 4 or 2 by 6, depending on the type of palette you want to work. And again, it's not a bad idea to look at some actual pictures of some actual palettes to kind of train your eye, because then I can look at this and go, oh, actually that height is a little bit too high. Like the boards are shallower compared to how wide they are. And I'm just sort of sliding these sliders around. There we go. Um, So no big deal. I can, if I want, put in subdivisions width is what I made the longest. So basically depth is how wide it is height, and then width is how long it is. Um, but I put a subdivision in there just so there's something in the middle. Not always necessary, but for what I'm going to do later, it can help for a trick kind of later on down the line. But when I'm done with that, I can bring up my modeling toolkit. And this is not even the most basic board you can have. This is too basic because it has these like those sharp edges that I'm always saying, we want to avoid these if we can. Now, normally I do not support, grabbing a whole thing and saying, let's bevel everything except for the middle. But we're going to do that because we kind of can. So I'm making sure to deselect the middle, and you do that by holding down Shift. So if I drag select all the edges, I can then hold down Shift and deselect this middle section. You can also, another way to get this is to drag select over here. You can see it gets all these edges. Hold down Shift and drag select over here, and it gets all those edges. The middle ones are not connected, so they don't get got. And I'm going to go to bevel here. Now, my numbers are somewhat meaningless to you. If you make yours at a different scale, things like fraction and depth, they don't transfer. They're relative to what they're dealing with. The only number that might matter is that I use even numbers of segments. I use even numbers of segments because it kind of lets me keep an edge loop where the original edge loop was. If you use odd numbers of segments, that kind of goes away. Um, and you can see here I've gone down to a pretty small fraction, and unfortunately I gotta like click off to see what it looks like. This is not to make it really look like a board. It's to make it look not like the most basic default cube that's ever been made. It's just a little bit. It's just a little bit of an edge. And what we do, this is going to be multiplied out, right? Like this is going to be duplicated into lots and lots of boards. So I want all of them to at least have this, right? There's not necessarily any indents in it and none of that stuff, but at the very least, I believe one of my examples has this mild variant. Yeah, so this one you can see that those light kind of edges. You can see it better on here. That means they beveled other edges. So the light's going to catch the edge a little bit. It's going to look at least like it's a real solid thing. There's at least some image fidelity there, as opposed to this one here, where they definitely didn't do any of that. So like this is kind of like too basic. We know how to bevel edges. We know how to, you know, get that stuff in there. But the idea is to that have like a bare minimum, like a floor, no simpler than this, shall we go? And then what we can do is we can then duplicate it out. Now, this takes a little bit of planning on your part, but you kind of decide how big you want the palette to be. And then we can say edit, duplicate special. And I'm going to make these copies, not instances. We'll get into why in just a second, but I want 8 of them, and I want them to translate along the z-axis. Let's go with 2. I might have to change that number. I'm guessing a little bit as to how big a number I want. And I said apply, and I went in the wrong direction. So we're going to say -2. Huh. Oh, interesting. Let's make sure there's not Yeah, that can happen. So for some reason, it is not listening. Let's try to scale. Oh, that's why. I have some weird settings in here from the last time. I must have mirrored something. I had a -1 in there. So it was probably going like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Um, yeah, there we go. Okay, that makes more sense. But I can look at that and I can say, oh no, that's too far apart. I can go back into duplicate special and I can say -1.3 or something. Yeah, much, much, much more better. But I made them copies because copies means that these are all different shapes as opposed to instances where they're all connected to each other. And then I'm realizing that I have to undo because I didn't name this. So whenever we make copies of something, plank or board or whatever you want to call it, but you have to name it. Then I go -1.3. Okay, and now they say plank and then plank 1 through 8. So plank, this is like the OG plank. Kind of good to keep an eye on that one, but then these are all named after it. So very, very important. We don't want cubes 1 through 45 in here. We want things to be named, and that's the easiest way to do it, is name it before you duplicate it. But all right, because I made these copies instead of instances, they are all separate from each other. So there's a lot of things I can do to make these different. And I am missing the vertical struts. I'm not going to bore you with putting those in. That's easy enough. And you can put a bottom to this or not. The bottom can look the same as the top or not. But when we're putting something together, there's a lot of things we can do to add a little bit of variation so that it's not mechanically, mathematically perfect. And that's what this example is. So there's a few things that they did to make this look not perfect. First, you can actually see that this is like overhanging a bit, these struts, which is cool, which is a cool idea to do, right? So our tendency in here is to line up everything perfectly, but like maybe not. So one thing, and it might be easier to do this from the top view. I actually want this to be closer. So we're gonna go to edit, and all I just was undo, and this is typical. Yeah. Okay, more better. This is pretty typical of me, is to go back and go, I want to change something. Let yourself do that. This is not a one-way trip. Duplicate special. You might put a few things in there. You might even move a few things around and go, and you fix it. But all right. So from this top view, I can just move them around. I don't even have to make them like look different from each other. I just have to shift them around, right? Take this perfection that the computer gave us and like nudge it a little bit. And already that's just a little bit more natural. And how much these things are changed just depends on how lived in and worn out you want something to be. And by the way, there are probably systems and codes in place that can kind of do this on a larger scale automatically. So if you've got, I don't know, like well, no one really models bricks, but if you had that, you could probably like code something, press a button, and it rotates everything by like zero point 0.1 degrees in random directions. Um, but the other thing we can do, since we are learning how to manually model, is tilt these things just a little bit. And it can be tricky because like too much, it could be, it doesn't quite work. There we go. I come back here and I look at it. So it's like it's machine made. They're pretty close together and they're fairly even, but they're not identical. The negative space in between these boards is not identical. That's what we were going for. And the last way that you could do this actually would be from the side view. We can, now this is going to look a little bit more broken, but we could always tilt a few of these. Now the trick for this is that, see how that's probably now a little bit lower, and it's going to be resting on something eventually. So I do have to, move this up a skosh. So we can also tilt things up in that manner. Um, it it's a much more obvious thing though. So use sparingly, and just know that it can't go below any of these because there's going to be something underneath there. All right, so that doesn't even involve any, that's not really modeling even. That's just like placing the things with a slight bit of care so that they don't look all identical to each other. Um, and if you really want to, I can grab this. I can hit Control D. And instead of OG1, I'm going to say vertical 1. Because what I'm going to do is, let's see. Nope. Yep. So we are rotating these things. I think I have the wrong setting. Oh, no, I don't. Okay. Yeah, yes, I do. Sorry, I had to change a setting from world to object because of a lesson. But we're going to come into this view. We're going to bring this here. And before I get too cute about where it is, I do have to remind myself that I made this out of the exact same board as the others, which is fine to start off with, but in reality, I want it to be a bit different. One of the best ways I can do that is to make it a little bit chunkier, right? I do also have to kind of like scale it in a touch because it's absurdly long. There we go. And we can use the top views and the side views to kind of like figure out where we want it to go. And if scaling it gets a little bit too finicky, if your mouse like is dragging it too far, remember you can always type in some numbers here. So if you're like, oh, that's the Y direction. No, Z direction. No, it was this direction. Just kidding, it's this direction. So 0.86 will make that slightly larger. 0.84 makes that slightly smaller. So I can go in there and kind of like nudge things a little bit to get it to where I want. And remember, we're trying to get it close, but we don't have to be too cute about it. You don't want to intersect, so you want them to be close. And then I'm gonna align this here. Yeah, I moved them up a little bit too far before. There we go. And once I know that, all right, this is the thickness that I want for this is the height that I want for this, the width, then I duplicate that and I move it back here. And if I really want to know how it's lined up, I can go in my side view, or front view, pardon me, and do this. And the result, because things are off, is that you look at this. It's not quite landing. That's a good thing. Visual interest. But again, none of this is actually a modeling. I mean, it is modeling, but it's not like the boards are all technically identical to each other. We've just rotated them and skewed them a little bit so that they look a little funny. But then the next step is to actually make the boards different from each other. If we really want to make this, actually I should probably save this, but if we really want to make this kind of work for us, sorry, I had to go navigating to save this. But yeah, if we really want this to work for us, um, there's a couple things we maybe want to do with these planks to make them more different, especially if we want this to look like dilapidated or broken or anything like that. Um, Now there would be a temptation to not only, we're moving these, rotating them around so that they're uneven, but to um like skew them like this, like to scale them a little bit. Um we we could do that. I don't think it's the most effective way though, because if we think about how these work in real life, someone manufactures a bunch of planks, relatively low grade, but they're still pretty uniform. And then the problems come with when it's being put together, or how it breaks afterwards and then gets re-put back together, right? Like that's kind of what we're looking at. And if that's the case, then the differences are not going to be that one is skinnier than the other. Like one of these planks are all going to be manufactured the same. The difference is they're going to be warped. They're going to be broken. And that's one of the reasons we put this like little middle thing in here, because we could potentially just grab this and bring it down, which did not do enough. I didn't damage it enough to make it visible. Oh, I know why. We need to tell this edge mesh display. I probably have to tell it to harden the edge. Yeah. So there's a bend in it now. And you can see it better actually in this negative space between these two planks. Um, I'm I should probably just do this up like a lot just to prove the point. We're not seeing it as much in the lighting, and part of that might be because this is generic Maya lighting. Um, but that's one thing we can do. The other thing we can do is on some of these add a couple of edge loops. Just kidding. It works best if we have it already selected. There we go. So if we do this, I can grab these, bring them down a bit, and now suddenly there's a bend in the board. Now I might have to then bring the whole board up a little bit so that it's like, where it belongs. But we can pull stunts like this, and we can insert edge loop. If I consider like what's the most likely scenario for things, the boards warp in this direction. This looks more like it would almost be a crack, which is hard to do because you'd have to model in a whole bunch of jaggedy edges. I've had people try to do that before. But this is a sort of very lo-fi, not very time-consuming way to really make something look like it's got a lot more going on. Look what it's doing for the lighting, right? Now the lighting actually has something to hit other than being identical, right? And we can, do that for all of those. And then if there's another palette, you do the same thing. You just maybe mix up the order or something, and suddenly they look entirely different. Um, Now the other reason I put the thing in the middle is that what you could do if you got really fancy with some of these edges, this is pretty simple. Two edge loops, move it up, two edge loops, move it down. But if you did something a little bit more than that, if you really got into, let's grab this one because it's overhanging a little bit, insert edge loop. So if you really like, let's see, I'm going to go from this direction so I can just grab all the vertexes. It's easier with all those beveled edges to select this as a vertex rather than the edges. But let's say I want to do something like this, like to really kind of, I could even if I, no, I don't want to twist. And then bring that up a little bit, right? Like, but if I did something quite a lot to that board, and then the other side of it was like kind of plain, one thing you could potentially do is split this board in half and take this end and combine it with some other end that you did up differently, right? If you have another board, let me see if I can find one that's, well, it's not hanging over the edge by much, so I'll just make it hang over the edge by much. There we go. There we go. So if you've got different boards that you've done up differently and you kind of want to, you could also bevel this a little bit to make it a little bit more gradual. Um, but if you want to like have this end on one side and this end in the middle or something like that, you can kind of cut them in half and then recombine them, merge vertexes and combine and separate and everything to get different variations. You could also just rotate them around. So that this edge is over here on this board, no one's going to know it's the same, right? Because there's too many other things going on. All right, so in terms of this assignment, what we're looking to do is start off by making sort of a base piece of wood, like just the base. I think this one is pretty base right here. Yeah. A little bit of beveling, like what's the simplest we're willing for this to be? What's the cleanest we're willing for this to be? Um, and start off with that and, duplicate special, get, you know, uh, get it situated, get a general layout of your palette. Do you want pieces underneath? Is it just these? Get all that stuff situated. And then as you're looking at it, say, okay, what details can make these pieces a little bit different? And I've got some notes here on stuff like, well, the boards are bigger, you can see them, so we can see them really well. So what do we change? Now there's another video that goes over the screws. Those are pretty tiny compared to the board. Does it matter if they are different? Right? We want to spend our time accordingly. I want you guys to think about if you're having to work efficiently because you're on a tight budget for a TV show or a commercial or something, or games, what level of fidelity do we need? What level of fidelity can we have? All right. So get creative with how you put these boards together. And you should be able to get something that looks pretty interesting. And the other video, which is much shorter, will go over how to do, how I make the screws.